Let's talk about the core competent. So, this is the online lecture for the in person workshop that we are throwing here in June and many times going forward. This is going to be a spot where we have all the information wrapped up in one spot, not necessarily edited, a little bit longer format, some tangents, stuff like that. The workshop, much more condensed version of the online learning. But of course, we're going to get one-on-one touch points. So that'll be amazing. All of the exercises that we talk about in this workshop are going to be in the YouTube playlist. So if you're ever curious about movements, they're going to be in there. And so today, again, we're going to go over the core. We're going to talk about what it is, how it functions, and the interplay between breathing and core stability. Because a lot of people don't know how to brace and breathe. They are a little bit different, of course, and we're going to go over that here in a bit. Who am I? Some guy. No, I'm joking. I'm Dr. Chase. I have worked with CrossFit athletes for half a decade now. Tons and tons of experience with athletes across the board, though I've been in the industry for about a decade as a trainer, but now as a sports chiropractor with my chiropractic office in CrossFit gyms in the Austin, Texas area. So if you ever need help, we're here. But what we want to do is we want to establish some baseline. So we're going to have some testing here. And of course, you can do this at home. You can do unless you have a barbell with weight, you might not be able to do it at home. But this is definitely something that you could do on your own time as a good test, and then implement some of the exercises that we're going to go through, retest it later. So of course, in the in-person workshop, we're going to be doing these tests. We have a max L sit, pretty straightforward. We're going to put 60 seconds on the clock. Give yourself the longest hold. Another piece of information that you can get on top of that is, let's say if you can only hold for 10 seconds, I'm going to get back up, get maybe another 10 seconds, another 5 seconds. Within that 60-second cap, how many seconds do you accrue? In reality, the unbroken set isn't that much different than the aggregate set, but they're just two good metrics that we can use. Then we have an unbroken set of good mornings. Now, with that good morning, we are going to use half of our body weight on that barbell. So if I weigh 200 pounds, I'm going to put 100 pounds on the bar. You get the idea. From here, what we're doing is we're going for our max unbroken set. Again, just how many you can do in one sitting. We don't want to be resting any more than 3 seconds per rep. It's okay to brace at the top. If you know how to brace, you're defeating the purpose of this workshop. Just kidding. But we don't want to just be panting at the top of each rep. That won't count. But you can absolutely come up, take a breath of air, rebrace, and go for another one. That's totally fine. It doesn't have to be smooth and continuous like a metronome. And then last but not least is the max unbroken set of V-ups. Disregard the good morning component on there. That's a old portion of it's old part of the slides. We'll eliminate that here. And so with these three pieces of information, last is going to be that max unbroken set of V-ups. Now, with that, again, just like the good mornings, you don't have to be continuously moving the whole time. It's okay if you take a half-second breath at the bottom to rebrace and get that core activated to come back up for one last one. But all three are going to be our test-retest metrics. So as we go through the in-person workshop, we will come back to this at the end and retest it. And so for you listening at home, maybe we shoot to redo this in a month, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, something like that, where we've put on the calendar, we are going to do this again to see with what we're doing if we're getting any improvement, because that's the whole point of all of this. But so now we have this data because we've done our 3 tests. We're going to hold on to that. Let's get into what is the core, because you can never control something that you don't know what it is. If I don't know where the cursor is on my mouse, I'll never be able to interact with my computer. If I don't know where my core is, or I don't know what is even my core, how am I ever going to use the best stabilization strategies? So when we think of the core, I like to think of it from the bony anatomy first, because your bony anatomy is the thing that is, in this case, protecting and encasing the central nervous system, the brain, the spinal cord, and the spinal roots coming out. Those are the things that, if damaged, we get really bad things come about from that. Whether we're talking concussion, TBI, whether we're talking paraplegic things where you're getting into an accident and you're severing the cord in some way, shape, or form. Now, with modern times, your survivability is much higher. But back in hunter-gatherer times, evolutionary terms, you're dead in the water. So your body is really good at protecting those things. And so if I start with the axial skeleton, this is going to be the core, if you will. That's going to be the skull, everything within the spinal column. And in some instances, we don't attach in the pelvis into this conversation. But the reality is there's a lot of big muscles that attach onto the pelvis that go to the spine. So this is where the two pictures might not line up 100% with how I think about it. But if you take every spinal vertebra, anything that attaches to those vertebra, and call them core, you wouldn't be wrong. So your skull attaches to your vertebra in the cervical spine. Your ribs are attached to your thoracic spine. Your collarbone and your shoulder girdle more or less connects into there. And finally, your pelvis again connects onto your tailbone, your sacrum. So knowing that we have all of the bones in the center, those bones are held up by muscles. When it comes to the muscles, there's lots and lots of them, but we can think of, again, anything that attaches onto the rib cage, anything that goes from the spine to something else. This is all core musculature. If I were to do a headstand, I'm using my core musculature. When I'm doing an L sit, or think of a Z press where you're sitting in that L position, I have to use a lot of core stability to keep my torso upright. So on the backside, again, we have all the ones that you love: paraspinals, your QL musculature. Some fun ones that most people don't think about are going to be these serratus muscles. They basically help with breathing and respiration. Oh, what a surprise. And then this picture on the right-hand side is basically if you took a guillotine and you cut me straight down the front, so I plopped into two pieces, front and back, you're looking inside the abdominal cavity with all of the guts taken out. So we can see at the top, there's that dome, that diaphragm, and then everything underneath it, that's all still core musculature. We'd like to think about it. You have your paraspinals, or sorry, not the paraspinals, you have your iliopsoas, you have your QL, you have your pelvic floor musculature. All of that helps to, again, create some sort of tension and rigidity through the spinal column to make sure that, again, you don't move in a way that hurts yourself. We can also think of all of the connective tissue that plays into this as well. So some of y'all may have seen this kind of content from anatomy trains. That's exactly where these diagrams are from, showing some of the different fascial lines that we know exist within the body. All of them, of course, are going through the midline, through the core in some way, shape, or form, attaching on to the spine. And so this is why the spine is that true component of what is your core. It's not necessarily your abdominal wall. It's not your six pack. Your core is your spine and all of the muscles that stabilize it. Last little piece here, I would not be a chiropractor if I did not talk about this in some way, shape, or form. Because of where the nerve supply for your abdominal wall, your core, that most people are interested in, especially with this kind of conversation, are supplied through the thoracic spinal segments. And so if you have, per se, issues with spinal health, thoracic mobility, things like that, we can see some forms of dysfunction in the abdominal wall show up. Now, literature has not been shown to be like, oh, is this because of neural compression? Is this because of positional inhibition? Really, it doesn't matter, because what makes your upper back healthy will make your lower back healthy. What makes your lower back healthy gives you core stability. That core stability then influences the two. Everything feeds into itself. But we do know, again, that from a pain perspective, from a sensation perspective, from a motor output perspective, the abdominal wall musculature, in which you can see that with that picture on the left, all the cutaneous nerves going through there, this abdominal wall is supplied by that thoracic spine. So you can absolutely influence your abdominal wall musculature through your upper back mobility. Again, is it the biggest deal? No, but I wouldn't be doing my job if we didn't talk about it. So again, we have all of these pieces. We have the bones, that central part, that axial skeleton is what we're going to be framing upon. We have the muscular anatomy, everything coming in. You don't need to know the specific names, but all of these muscles are coming together to solidify that spine so that it doesn't inherently deviate. We have connective tissue structures that do that. And we know that the nervous innervation, where the sensation is coming from the spine itself, because that's where all of those nerve endings are coming from. We can get into this idea that the core's main job is the spine, whether to move it into a position or to stop it from moving. And so, of course, we have three silhouettes here: a deadlift, which We do not want our spine moving. We want our spine rigid as we go through that range of motion, all of that power going into our legs to bring the barbell up. Then on the opposite side, we have something like a V-up or a toes to bar, where I'm using my core to compress and create a new shape where I get into a position to fulfill a movement standard. Again, something like a toes to bar or a V-up. And finally, in the middle, you have this balance of I need to be able to move my spine into a position and then hold it and stop myself from moving. So a handstand walk, I need to have enough stability that I don't just fall over, but I can't be so rigid that I can't operate and maneuver. So this is ultimately what the core does. And so everything that we should do should support either of these 2 points, whether to stop it from moving or to move it through space. So we'll get into our first kind of set of interventions. This is going to be for the anterior chain, basically anything on the front. We have some isometric and some dynamic movements. In the workshop, we are not going to go over all of these, but we're going to go over some of the main ones and kind of easiest ways to go in. But these are how we would scale them up across time. For isometric holds, I like to start off with dead bug, transition to hollow hold, transition then into a GHD sit-up hold. We're just making it harder and harder, kind of extending those levers. Then on the dynamic side, on the movement side, we have a hollow pulse where I am getting some more contraction outside of just a hollow hold. We're not just holding a position, we're getting a little bit of that dynamic movement. Then we go into a V tuck, a V up, and then a full GHD. This is how we progress these things. Finally, staying with the anterior chain, there's a lot of these exercises that dabble in a number of different groups, but this is going to be our suspended category where more or less there is a portion of the core, the trunk, that is going to be supported via suspension. So whether we're talking a hanging variation, toes to bar, knees to chest, things like that, or in the top of a dip. So if I'm on my dip bars, I lock my elbows out. Now I can pull that pelvis up in, similarly to a knees to chest. An L-sit is a great example of this as well, but utilizing the musculature on the front to either stop motion, the isometric holds, or create dynamic motion. These will fulfill a lot of people's itch to do core work, but this is just the beginning. This is just one side of the equation. We would be doing ourselves a disservice if this was the only type of core training that we did. Before we talk about what the other pieces are, I want to talk about this idea of stability versus mobility, because the reality is we are a jigsaw of motion where I have a bunch of mobile units and I have a bunch of stable units. Now, the graphs that we have up right now, the charts that we have up here, are more or less what we're going to try to train for. So if we look at the skeleton up on the left here, I want to try to stabilize the low back, because if the low back moves too much, I usually end up with problems. I want to build mobility into the thoracic spine, the upper back. We know a lot of people have stiffness there. That may be playing into some core stuff. Again, whether it is or isn't, we know that a healthier thoracic spine is going to improve your health and performance overall, so you might as well do it. But again, we want mobile hips, mobile shoulders. We want stable elbows, stable knees, things like that. And so if we think of all the different planes of motion we have, there's a lot of different angles that we have to protect ourselves from while we're lifting. Thankfully, for the majority of my patients that I see in the CrossFit world, things get very, I'm not going to say black and white, but it becomes very easy to see that a lot of our movements are in what we call the sagittal plane, forward and back. This is a deadlift. This are kipping swings, handstand walks. There's so many things where I'm going in just a pure forward and back motion repeatedly over and over and over. Then we have the coronal or frontal plane. That was the plane in which the guillotine came down and cut me with. So it divides you into a front and back side versus the sagittal plane. If I took a knife and cut myself down, I have a left and right now. Frontal plane, this is going to be all of our lateral stuff. So if you're doing jumping jacks, your arms are going in that frontal plane. If you're doing dumbbell lateral raises, if you're doing a Cossack squat, you're moving into that frontal plane where we're coming side to side. And then finally, horizontal transverse plane. This is going to be rotation and twisting. Not a lot of rotation and twisting in the sport of CrossFit. A little bit when it comes to things like dumbbell snatching, where we are getting that single arm variation. But we can see that there are all these different movements that sometimes I want to move things, sometimes I don't want to move things. But a big portion that we want to bring in is this breathing component. And as you can see, it's breathing is involved with all of these, especially because the rib cage as this big umbrella that opens and closes in multiple different planes and vectors. If I think of my chest bone, when I breathe in, it's moving forward and back. My rib cage is moving out to the sides, as well as I compress in and out with my rib breath, my rib cage literally curls in. So that's on that transverse plane. So we're getting all of these motions when it comes to breathing. And that's why we utilize breathing as a big core stimulator or a component of how to become core competent, if you will. So again, when we have all of these different regions that want to move, we need to make sure that we stabilize each segment of the spine. So now this really quick goes into what the fuck's even a segment. A segment is going to be that picture all the way down on that bottom left. If you think of one joint with two bones, that is a movement segment. So normally we think of that bottom bone not moving at all. And that top bone has all the different planes of motion, right? It can translate forward and back, and it can rotate around that axis. It can translate up and down and rotate around that axis. And it can translate side to side and rotate around that axis. And that's how every bone in your body can move. To what degree, we have that graph on the right showing each section of the spine, the cervical, your neck, the thoracic, your rib cage, and the lumbar, your low back. They all move in slightly different movement patterns. So sagittal, that forward and back motion is going to be that yellow section. We have a lot in the neck and we have a lot in the low back. The low back is good at flexing, extending, going forward and back. Thoracic spine, not so much. We move into rotation. So as you can see, the rotation and the lateral flexion, both of those on that right-hand side, do only account for moving to one side. So you can basically times them by 2 to get both rotations to each side or lateral flexions to each side. So as you can see, there's some outliers in the fact that the neck has some crazy range of motion on some parts, but the majority of rotation actually happens at the thoracic spine. Again, because if you times it by 2, you see that you get more than the straight flexion and extension. And then with lateral flexion, again, we're getting decent amounts of motion throughout all of these segments, but the low back is going to be a great mover forward and back. Thoracic spine needs to move in every single direction, but it's not inherently the most mobile because there's a massive rib cage connected to it. And then finally, your neck. Again, we are not surprised at all that the neck is mobile, seeing that the only thing on top of it is just a melon, your dome, hanging out there. So again, we want to be able to control this movement. It's not that we want it to be stiff and unable to move, but we need to be in control of that motion. And so when it comes to how much motion or stability do we need, plays into what is our sport. So again, if you're coming from the CrossFit community, you need to be a combination of both. You need to be both mobile and stable enough. You need to be stable enough to do our heavy lifting, our Olympic weightlifting, powerlifting, out of objects, things like that. But you need to be mobile enough to do the gymnastic moves, pull-ups, handstand walks, all of that. Olympic weightlifting also constitutes that. And so knowing that there's this balance to be played, we need to keep in mind also on top of that what sport you're playing. So I don't expect my power lifters, people that are just squatting, benching, and deadlifting, to be as mobile as per se gymnasts. I do not expect gymnasts to be able to stabilize as well as power lifters. And this is the line that we have to play whenever we're talking about core stability training, is we want to make sure that we play the balance of what is required for our sport in everyday life and what is not, because there can be times where doing extra core work doesn't inherently improve my outcomes. In fact, we can be funneling ourselves into compensations if we're just chasing the same thing over and over. We see this a lot with mobility. I need to become more mobile. The reason why my overhead position sucks is because I'm not mobile enough. And then what happens is there's no stability because all you've worked is mobility. So whenever the barbell goes into a position, again, let's say into the overhead, you try to stabilize and then you injure yourself. Same thing with, let's say, the low back, because that's 99% of the time people that are having issues with their low back talk about weakness in their core. And the reality is their core may be, there's probably some weakness in your core, but will isometric holds, will just training your abdominal wall be the thing that stabilizes that low back? Maybe not. And so we need to play this balance of mobility versus stability. And so knowing what sport you're in really helps us narrow that down. Last piece in regards to the clinical interpretation of how and why we want to think of core stability is this idea of negating tissue damage. Because again, the only reason why most people want to do more core work is one, to have a six pack and look jacked and whatnot, which that's all nutrition. That's not what this talk is about. Sorry, I didn't put the PSA out before. But the reality is that most core work is done to, I need to become stronger, or I keep hurting myself, and so I need to work on my core. Pain does not inherently mean tissue damage, but they definitely can go together. We've all cut our hand, we've all stubbed our toe, we've all broken something, right? But the reality is when we run into these pains that come up, we don't inherently see true tissue damage being there all the time. A lot of the times your body will pull the e-brake or stop you, whether hit you with a muscular spasm, shut down that muscle peripherally, just turns it off at the primary motor neuron. Probably shouldn't say that. Your body will turn off your ability to interact with whatever exercise you're doing. We've all probably been there before, where hinging, doing a deadlift or something like that, we receive the tweak. Our body senses some form of motion that it doesn't, gives you that error signal. Everything shuts down. The low back locks up. And even if you want to try to deadlift again, your body's not going to allow you. Now, in that scenario, is there actually tissue damage? We could order him an MRI and find out right then and there. But the reality is that pain does not inherently mean tissue damage. And so getting that pain signal to come down through desensitization drills, through work in the sense of some of the accessory work that we're going to do to build make robust that nervous system, that peripheral nervous system sensing in on what that joint is doing, that will reduce the likelihood of any pain coming back up, because your brain is not perceiving this excessive motion as danger. Because one, we know how to stabilize when we need to, and two, we've been into positions within our core training to again, make it so that our nervous system isn't so on guard whenever we come there in the first place. So a big takeaway in regards to the stability versus mobility component. This is an expansion of that first one, to stop the spine from moving. A more specific way to think about it is stopping the spine from losing segmental spinal control. So losing the awareness and the keeping together that two bone, one joint system. If you have excessive motion there that your brain is not anticipating, let's say I'm going to bend forward and touch my toes. I'm bending forward to tie my shoes in the morning. If your brain perceives that there is excessive motion that it is not in control of, it is going to protect you. It is going to lock it down. It is going to give you a pain signal to go, hey, error, try again. Do not use that motor pattern. But the same thing applies again. That pain might not truly be tissue damage, but it is a sign that you've lost segmental control. And again, a sign that we should be working on this core stability. So the big boys on the back, the posterior chain. A lot of people may have low back pain because their low backs are hyperactive. This is the extension compression model of spinal stability, ECSS, as touted by some other practitioners. If your brain or if your body doesn't have any other musculature to utilize, it will use your low back to stabilize, basically by just cranking down on all of the muscles in the low back to create that hyperextension. If you've ever seen somebody with a really hard anterior pelvic tilt, Donald Duck butt, if you want to think of it that way, those spinal muscles are so strong that they're just compressing everything down. But oftentimes too, we can see a lot of weakness coming out of people's low backs and paraspinals. And so giving some lip service or paying attention to some of these tissues is important. And so a couple of these that I would recommend everybody be doing would be these three for the posterior chain. The Jefferson curl, basically, can I control the lengthening of that posterior chain? And then we have the reverse hyper, one of my favorite machines, invented by Louis Simmons. Highly recommend it. If your gym does not have it, there are ways to do it on a GHD, but it doesn't work quite the same. And then finally, we have good mornings, in which there's tons of variations there. Technically, you can even think of an RDL as a good morning, but instead of the barbell being on your back, it is loaded into your hands. Some people will poo-poo at that, but again, you're just hinging. Another way that this is more getting everything to activate, but will help with that desensitization, is basically improving our ability to take axial load. So whether we're talking a yoke carry or a rack hold where either I am in the back rack or the front rack, really doesn't matter. I just stand the bar up out of either the J hooks. I don't even need to walk it back. I just stand it up. Or I can actually carry, again, a yoke. That axial load, one, creates a large amount of stimulus to your nervous system to create core stability. That's your spine. If everything is not active, we're going to have things fall out of place. Simple as that. And so this is a way that we can easily and objectively check our ability to maintain that axial load. So I really like these as a good test retest. But these are going to be the ways that we would challenge the posterior chain and some of the other musculature regarding that. And so finally, bracing and breathing. The big piece, the sleeper, if you will, of core stability training. Now, of course, muscles, we touched on them a little bit before, but this is its homage. It gets its full day in the sun. You have the muscles of respiration, you have the diaphragm being the biggest one, literally the biggest one, and functionally, we'll say the biggest one. As that diaphragm contracts, you can see it in the dome shape on the left-hand side photo. As that contracts, what it's going to do is it's going to pull down. It's going to pull onto the spine. You can see a couple of attachment points right here. Hopefully you can see my cursor. And so that rigidity there, that pulls down, it almost like a piston will pull the air into the lungs coming in through the top. Then on the right-hand side, a couple of other muscles, your abdominal wall. You have the obliques, you have rectus abdominis, you have the between costal is rib, the muscles in between your ribs. You also have muscles up in your neck. All of these things basically pull and ream on that rib cage to expand the rib cage and compress the rib cage. Or a better way to think about it, more accurate way, is to increase the volume of the rib cage and the lungs within it and decrease. That's how we're pumping this bad boy. And so if we know that all of the respiratory muscles live on the axial skeleton and all of them influence the rib cage, they have to be core musculature. They have to be able to create stability for us. And so this is where this idea of intra-abdominal pressure really comes in. This is the bracing. So I love the picture on the left. Picture on the right is maybe a little bit easier way to think about it, but the picture on the left gives us the functional component, the active component of it. So again, when I think of the abdominal, or what most people think of the core, the abdominal wall in the front, if we take that abdominal wall at the front and we continue it all the way into the back, you have your lumbar musculature, your QL, paraspinals, all of that stuff. We have a continuous ring going around us. So that creates this cylinder. At the top of the cylinder, you have the diaphragm. Again, it's that little dome on the top. And same thing with the pelvic floor at the bottom. So you can think of it less of a cylinder and more of like a pill, if that makes sense. And so with this pill, you can pull the top down and decrease the volume within. This is where you increase the pressure, because you can either create more pressure by reducing the volume or increasing what is in it. And so when we're bracing, when we're creating intra-abdominal pressure, we try to do both. We try to compress the actual cylinder, the pill, right? I tense in my abdominal wall, I tuck everything in, I brace my pelvic floor, I give myself a Kegel a little bit, and then I breathe in. I pull my diaphragm down to create that pressure. That intra-abdominal pressure acts as an airbag between the abdominal wall and your lumbar spine. That is how we create massive stability when we're doing something like a belt, a back squat. This is the natural weightlifting belt as you can see in the picture on the left. And so, again, functionally, when we're thinking of that intra-abdominal pressure, you'll look at the picture on the left, we're really aiming to stabilize the spine using active muscle and passive connective tissue fascia to create this extremely tight, well-woven stick that then can functionally take us through all of our motions. On the right, we can see that there are some positional things that come with the canister or creating that intra-abdominal pressure. And whether you want to call it scissor position or having a posterior cross, having anterior pelvic tilt, really, it doesn't matter. But this idea of centering the rib cage over the pelvis is a good way to put us in neutral so that we can create the most abdominal pressure possible. This is why hollow holds, dead bug, really hammer that position so that you, at a subconscious level, always know, oh, I need to be here so that I can create the most pressure and stability. A way that you can work on this at all points in time is through belly breathing. A lot of people know of belly breathing, they've heard of it, yoga breathing, but there's still a lot of people that I've seen in my practice that know belly breathing. I say, amazing, why don't you show me? And they go with the dysfunctional breathing. So dysfunctional breathing is the breathing that you can think of people that oftentimes dysfunctional breathing isn't inherently dysfunctional in the sense of, wow, you're not getting air, but it is counter to the best way to get air in. Because again, that diaphragm is the biggest muscle that we have. And so what should be happening, why it should be belly breathing, is that that diaphragm should be pulling down and pushing out all of the contents of our belly, because we're not aiming to be at full abdominal tightness all the time. When we're relaxing, when we're sitting in the chair, when we're having dinner, I don't need to have a rock solid core. I want to have some tension, some awareness, but ultimately, when I breathe, my belly should have room for expansion, because as that diaphragm drops down, it's going to push everything out. And so dysfunctional breathing a lot of the times is for people that are trying to look thinner. They're always pulling their belly in. So all I have is chest breathing to do. It's dysfunctional because you actually get less oxygen per breath, or less gaseous exchange, because the blood vessels at the top portion of your lungs aren't as dense as the portion at the bottom. When you draw from the diaphragm, it pulls more air into the lower portion, into the lower lobes of the lungs. But also, when I use breathing, this kind of upper breath, I can end up with all sorts of neck dysfunction, but it also stimulates the sympathetic nervous system. Whenever we're in fight or flight, a lot of the times it's very shallow chest breathing because we're trying to stay alive. Versus relaxed belly breathing, hence why it's yoga breathing, I'm really allowing myself to really expand. I drop my blood pressure. I expand through all that tissue. This is a way that we can create this awareness of the diaphragm and being able to draw air into that section of our belly to create that intra-abdominal pressure. So belly breathing would be something that I would do at all points in time, especially when I'm working, when I'm relaxing, things like that. Really trying to prioritize that. A simple way that you can also hack that is nasal breathing. Nasal breathing most of the time will force you to use more of a diaphragmatic breath. It's very infrequent that even if you take a very hard draw through your nose, you're going to use kind of this neck musculature as much as an open mouth breath. So if you switch to nasal breathing more oftentimes throughout the day, try to get more belly breathing in. This is a really simple way that you can foster better core development. And so the big takeaway in the breathing section is going to be that breathing is not bracing, and there's this continuum. Because for sure, I need to be breathing, but it needs to match my intensity. If I'm doing heavy resistance training, 1 rep max, big singles, we're going for PRs, baby. I may hold my breath the entire time or be on just leaving that breath out of my body. I brace, I lift, and I let that air out, but that's it. It's a very short time frame. I need the most stability. I actually will have all of the air in my body that I'll ever need. It's mostly just the carbon dioxide building up that I need to be worried about. But boom, I am using everything, all of that core musculature, that respiratory muscle, to stabilize the spine, the torso, the axial skeleton. Then on the flip side, You have something like a marathon. You're not going to hold your breath for that. You're going to be running for long periods of time. You need to constantly be cycling breath. We need some stability, but it's okay if that stability is done by other musculature that is not respiratory in nature. This is why we do see, though, if people are not great at utilizing all of their core musculature, these are individuals that we oftentimes see their backs blow up on long running workouts or 5K, half things like that, because their body has nowhere else to utilize stability. There's no way for them to keep maybe a little bit of stability through their abdominal wall musculature. They're using all of that respiratory muscle, stuff that could be stabilizing them a little bit better, and they're just using their hip flexor or their iliopsoas, their low back musculature, their QL, their erectors. This is something that we do see in the clinic quite often. And so then in the middle, we have the 2K row test, which is kind of a 50-50 of, man, I'm doing really heavy hinging, strong pulls for anywhere from 6 to 12 minutes, something like that, depending on how fast you do it. Hopefully not towards the 12, but we get it. And so having the balance of being able to stabilize enough that I can keep myself from falling out of position and tweaking myself or getting compensatory spasming through muscles that are just working too hard because they're doing too much. All the way to, hey, I need to be able to breathe and keep this cellular respiration, keep the glucose turning over into ATP cellular energy going. And that's where incorporating breathing into your core work, as well as when I have a more competent core, when I know how to interact with my abdominal wall musculature, with my low back, with the obliques, everything that we're going to finish out on here, if I have a very physical understanding of that, of how to create tension, how to create stability, the likelihood of our performance going up is immense. The likelihood of pain coming down because I'm not holding my breath during reps. I'm not holding my breath while I go through ranges of motion. I'm not unstable and constantly tweaking myself. All of this stuff leads to ultimately better performance and less pain. So finishing out our exercises, this is the rest of the planes. Again, frontal is going to be guillotine cuts me in half. I have forward and back, so we're going to be moving like this. And then rotation, that transverse plane. Lateral movements, side bends, whether we're doing that with a kettlebell or a barbell, fantastic. I also love doing these on the GHD just because we're changing the force vectors more or less, where with the barbell and the kettlebell, gravity is pulling me down to the side, so I'm pulling myself up. Versus the GHD side bend, gravity is still pulling me into that side bend, but the force is lateral to the spine rather than axial, kind of ripping it down. Different ways to stimulate the muscle. A lot of the times we get bored with stuff, so having things to kind of swap through, we love that. Finally, we can train actual rotation through utilizing those barbell twists or any Palloff variation. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of Palloffs just because most of the forces that we deal with are far greater than that is shown in a Palloff. But it is a good stimulator if you need a little bit of something, let's say in your warm-up. I love that. But these barbell twists, you can do those as you're warming up with the barbell for things like squats and deadlifts and stuff like that. So I really love that. And then finally, our breathing. Again, abdominal breathing, 360-degree belly breathing. If you do not know how to breathe into all three or all of the sections of your abdominal wall, in the front, out the sides, and into even your low back, you're going to have a hard time with being able to utilize that intra-abdominal pressure as well. So I would highly recommend that. There's a couple of other breathing drills, the last of which being that kettlebell breath, where we're putting a kettlebell on our stomach and breathing there. These are all, again, to help you create more rigidity via intra-abdominal pressure. They're not inherently there to get you jacked abs. Not that any of these by themselves will. Again, this is all diet will give you the six pack, but the breathing component of this is massively important. I would not skip that. Now that we know all of those pieces, I want us to go back and retest these three movements. Now that we know a little bit more about the core, maybe we've done some of these exercises for maybe a couple of weeks if you're retesting this after the fact, or even if this is the workshop and we're retesting them again, utilizing the new awareness, utilizing the new breathing and bracing strategies, we're going to go for the same three tests and compare and contrast. Were things easier? Were things harder? Was I more aware of activating certain parts of my core? Was I aware now of my breathing? And wow, the reason why I failed the LSIT wasn't because my core was done, is because I was holding my breath the entire time. And that's a component of the core stability. So having this data to go back and forth on is amazing. And so that is it, guys. I want to thank y'all so much for watching in on this. I hope that it answers more questions than it brings up, of course, when you're doing all this kind of stuff, learning on your own. There's a lot that we're trying to jam into this. Again, with 10 years in the industry and doctoral level knowledge of the human body, there's a lot that just rolls out here. And so if you ever have any questions, comments, concerns, you can absolutely email me, shoot me a text. If you're in the local Austin area, you can sign up for initial evaluation with us if you need some help, if you've been experiencing any pain. But that's it, guys. Play around with those exercises, do that test, retest, and we'll see you in the next one.